Welcome to Turning Pages, a series of in-depth conversations with authors about their works.
Set during the American Revolution, the Monmouth Manifesto is a piece of historical fiction. Its author, James Arnett, joins me on the program. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to ask you, what's your relationship to historical fiction? Like, are you a historical fiction reader? Because both of your books have been historical fiction.
Well, I sort of backed into it. I mean, as you may or may not know, I had a career as a corporate lawyer and then a business executive and so on. And later in life, I took up writing. I mean, I'd always enjoyed writing and had, whether it was memoranda or legal memoranda or the occasional, article for a newspaper or something like that. But I didn't start off with the idea that I was going to write historical fiction. What happened was that my grandfather, Arnett, had written a novel in the 1920s, which was never published. And when I was in probably my mid-40s or something, my grandmother, Arnett, gave me this manuscript, and she said, someday maybe you could arrange to have it published or do something with it, which I didn't focus on much at the time because I was busy with my career and my family and so on. But later in life, when I had a bit more time in my hands, I dug it out of a drawer somewhere to see if I could, get it published or do something with it. And the long and the short of it was that when I showed it to people in the publishing business, there was no interest.
Mm-hmm.
And I could tell that the novel had, some problems, but it was a novel about bootlegging and rum running in Saskatchewan in the 1920s when he lived in Regina. And so I started to read up on the subject a little bit, and I came across the story, which ended up being the core of my first novel, which is called Bean Fate. And I didn't start off with the idea I would write a novel, but I thought, maybe I could turn it into a treatment for a movie, because a treatment is sort of like, a short form, almost like a précis of a story. And I thought I could do that. And I spent some time on it and got some help from a screenwriter that I was introduced to. And the long and the short of that was that it sort of didn't go anywhere when I showed it to people in the industry. And I was sitting around one day and sort of bemoaning the fact, sitting around with this screenwriter, and I said, I've made this big effort, but I guess it's not going anywhere. It seems a shame. And he said, well, you could always turn it into a novel. And I thought, turn it into a novel? I mean, that's a big idea. I mean, I had maybe 10,000 words. So for a novel, you'd have to have 60,000 at least. You should have 100,000. And you've got to write dialogue. And I thought, I don't know that I could do that, but I guess I might as well give it a shot, which I did. So it ended up that I created this first novel called Bean Fate, which was based around true historical facts, specifically a murder that happened in Saskatchewan. And when that was finished, I thought I enjoyed doing it. I thought I had another one in me. And doing an historical novel was something I thought I could do, partly because I'm interested in history anyway. I enjoy doing the research, and it gives you an outline for a story. So that's what happened.
So obviously that one is connected to your grandfather's, writing. This one exists wholly on its own, and I'm curious what led you to this particular story out of the American Revolution.
Well, there's also, strangely enough, a family connection. I had heard from my wife the barest reference to this distant loyalist ancestor of hers who had ended up in Canada. And there was a bit of a story there about um, the trouble that he'd got into fighting for the Loyalists in the American Revolution. And I knew his name, so I looked it up. And much to my surprise, I found that there was a real story there that was mentioned in biographies of George Washington and even in histories of the American Revolution. So uh, that's how I got onto that story. Now it's a little dangerous to write about your wife's family, but that's what I did.
So, which of the two central characters is related to your wife?
Richard Lippincott.
Okay. So you plumb into the history of this then, like you said, the research you enjoy, but I have to imagine this is like a pretty intense amount of research to find out kind of where I don't want to say a minor character, but someone who is a much smaller figure than, say, a George Washington.
Oh yeah.
How much research, like how long a process is that, and what does that entail?
Well, writing the book took me 3 years, which included editing and so on. The research, I would say, probably took me a year. And it was, and by the way, I basically, I mean, I started it during the pandemic. I mean, I didn't go down to the States to libraries and all that stuff. I did it all online. It was amazing. And then if you do things online, then you look at a footnote and it says, well, they got this idea or this thought from such and such a book. So then I go on Amazon and order the book. And then I get that book, and then it might lead me to another book, that sort of thing. And I mean, I must have bought 50 or 60 books on Amazon over the course of a year or two, from which I did the research. It was frankly, it was quite amazing that you could, for me, that you could do all this research online.
So it's a lot of dot connecting and like one piece leading you to the next piece, leading you to the next piece.
Exactly. I mean, a couple of things though, major things. There were two major things I came across. One is that, as you know, there's if you've read the book, there's a court martial in the book. It's a key part of my novel. Well, I stumbled upon the fact that there was a transcript of the court martial down at the University of New Brunswick, where they have loyalist studies. So I was able to get the transcript of the court martial, and I built probably 5 or 6 chapters around that court martial.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing I came across was that in terms of original stuff, the other character, Moody, it turned out that he had written, well, first of all, I discovered that there was actually a biography written about Moody. And from that, I discovered that he himself had written a kind of a memoir of his escapades during the Revolution at the time in 1782. And I was able to get a copy of that. So those were two, key pieces of research that I was able to use as kind of a basis, if you like, for the book.
Do those help establish voice? Like either the transcript of Lippincott's like own voice in the transcripts, or Moody's voice within his own writing? Like, does that help you kind of convey when you're then trying to write as these characters, how they would talk or interact?
Well, let me reverse it. So on the case of Moody, as I say, I had his biography, plus I had his own narrative of his adventures so from that, I was able to get a fairly decent sense of his voice, if you like, of what kind of a character he was. I didn't have that for Lippincott. But for Lippincott, I did have the transcript of the court martial. So, and he spoke in his own defense in the court martial. So that gave me some sense. But I had to make up a lot more about his voice. Out of the other thing was in his case, I knew that he was a Quaker, and the Quakers are pacifists, and yet he was fighting in the American Revolution. So that was interesting to me. I mean, how what kind of a guy who was a Quaker would end up fighting? And so that gave me a sense of, he must have, it must have had some kind of internal conflict about doing that sort of thing.
Yeah, at one point in the book, early on, in fact, you have Richard and his wife talking, and his wife Esther points out, when your sense of right is challenged, you get irritated, and what the rebels are doing irritates you. I was curious as to how much that was an invented thing, or whether there was any indication.
That's totally invented.
Okay, so then in terms of inventing things for these characters, because obviously, like I said, they're true people, but we don't have their full story. How do you feel like a certain compulsion to work it so that it works for your story, or do you have like a obligation to the past?
Well, it's a very interesting thing about writing historical fiction, because pretty well by definition, you have to try to be faithful to what you know about the past. I mean, I don't think it wouldn't be fair game to characterize somebody in a way that you knew, wasn't their character. So, for example, in my first book, which was centered around Bean Fate, which was centered around the murder of Sam Bronfman's brother-in-law, and the Bronfmans, Sam and Harry Bronfman, and even Alan Bronfman, who have been alive in my lifetime, although they're dead. They've been dead for quite some time now. I had to be, very careful about that, trying to get a sense of what they were, but I had some help there, because, for example, Peter Newman had written a biography of Sam Bronfman. I came across actual interviews that they'd given in the press and so on, and they were people that were alive in my lifetime. I mean, I remember the way Sam Bronfman was characterized, in the press and so on, many, many years ago. So in that sense it was easier, but in that sense it was also trickier, because I had to feel that I was being faithful to what we knew about them. Whereas in the second book, Monmouth Manifesto, which is about an era 250 years ago, by definition, I had to make a lot more up. As I said, I had a significant amount to go on about Moody, but much less about Lippincott. I did have one other thing about Lippincott, actually, because there was a Lippincott family, I don't know what to call it, compendium or something, that was published, I don't know, 30 or 40 years ago in the States. And in it, in a footnote somewhere, there was a quote about the personality of Richard Lippincott by his grandson, who had said something about him, in 1850 or something. So I used that a bit too.
Right.
But it writing historical fiction generally is interesting, because on the one hand, you have to be faithful more or less to the facts as you know them, but on the other hand, you get to make stuff up, and it is fair game to a degree, I think, and I think most people that write it consider it to be fair. I mean, you can fiddle with the facts a little bit to fit your to fit in your story, because you can't, to get your timeline right or whatever. But you have to try to be faithful to the overall tenor of the people and the times.
Can I ask you about maps? I want to ask you, like, did you study the terrain that you're writing about, or like?
Well, I only study it, in books and online and stuff like that. I mean, now the maps that are in the book, which I had map maker here create, was based upon maps that were available one way or another publicly. I didn't go down and trace. I mean, I would have thought I would have done this, but because of the way it started in the pandemic, I never did.
Right.
So I didn't go. For example, for Bean Fate, the first one, which was in Saskatchewan, I actually went out there and kind of walked around where all this stuff happened. But the second book, which takes place in New Jersey and New York City and Philadelphia and so on, I didn't do that.
So then, in writing the action within, like these excursions that Moody undertakes and stuff, like, are you trying to have some veracity in terms of describing the terrain, or are you giving yourself the liberty to just kind of make it up for what
Oh no,
works?
I try my best to have veracity. I spent a lot of time reading up, getting obscure articles and all kinds of stuff to get a sense of the terrain. I mean, and there are rivers and creeks and all that stuff. I would read up and cross-reference, and I did my very best to be very accurate in that.
Does that accuracy translate also to kind of like the calendar and how you like write about what action is happening at what times?
The basic timeline is accurate, and in fact, that's one reason why somebody was a little critical that I had so many dates in the book, but I did that to try to keep track of it for people, but also to kind of verify when things happen. The only thing in there that I can recall where I was aware that I was using an event that happened, it didn't happen when I said it in the book, was in the last chapter where I had a letter describing an event, and while the letter was accurately quoted, it described an event for those people, but that happened at a different time.
Did you hesitate to use that letter in that way, or is that one of those liberties you're allowed to take as a historic fiction writer?
I thought it was a liberty I was allowed to take, but in my afterward, I did point that out.
Speaking of your afterward, you do describe, or rather, I guess it's in the acknowledgments rather than the afterward, the history quill. Is this like a group of historical fiction writers, or?
Yeah, it's an outfit in London, England. I don't know. To be honest, I'm not sure if it's a not-for-profit or if it's a for-profit, but it caters to the historical fiction writer community, basically in England, and they offer some facilities and so on. Yeah.
Right. Having written, Bean Fate, you mentioned earlier, you went to Saskatchewan. This one you didn't travel. I am curious what lessons you learned from the first book that you were then able to apply to writing this second book.
Well, what I would say is, as I indicated to you, initially I wasn't planning to write a novel at all when I did the first book, and my single main concern about starting to write the second book as a novel was I thought, can I do dialogue? I mean, that's really creative, doing dialogue. Can I, I'd never, tried to do that before. So, but when I'd finished what I discovered writing Bean Fate was that I could do dialogue, at least to my satisfaction, that I could do dialogue, and specifically that I could imagine if if one character says this, then the other guy might say that, and reply to that, the other guy might say this, the other guy might say that type of thing, and I could almost, not to overstate it, but I could almost sort of hear it in my head, so to speak. So when I started to write the Monmouth Manifesto, I had the confidence that I didn't have the first time around. I had the confidence that I could do that. So what I'd learned from the first book was that I had a certain confidence I could write a novel at all, and that I enjoyed doing it.
It's interesting to hear you say, having hearing the dialogue in your head, because that's one of the things I noticed in this book is that there are sequences written entirely as like internal monologue from either Moody or Lippincott's perspective. Was that something like a process that you intentionally worked out as to like kind of tell the action through their interpretation of the action?
Well, it was certainly intentional. I mean, I thought it was important to give some depth to the characters, to get inside their heads. Now, one thing I will say, one little discipline I had was, in my mind, there were two protagonists, Lippincott and Moody, which is, doesn't always happen in books, but sometimes you only have one protagonist. But I had two. And that there would be the only two people whose heads I'd get into, so to speak. Sometimes when I read books, I'm sort of surprised that some writers get a little loose on that, and they're in all kinds of people's heads. But in any event, that was a kind of a discipline I did for myself. But the reason was, of course, to give some depth to the characters.
It sounds like also maybe like a structural thing that you set for yourself, that like only these two people would be embodied within.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Another structural question for you. You start with May 24th, 1782, and it's almost like a flash forward. Yeah. What was the decision to put that action first and then kind of back the train up a little bit?
I thought I needed a bit of a grabber. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Because I was going to be starting in, and the story kind of builds, and the more interesting or exciting stuff happens later in the book. And I thought I wanted there to be something up front for the reader to sort of think to himself or herself, I wonder how that happens, sort of thing. So it was, in fact, in the first draft, it wasn't like that. I mean, that chapter was like, I don't know, chapter 50 in the first draft. And then I decided to do that. And I think looking back on it, it may not have been specifically suggested, but as a general proposition, I came out of a discussion I had with the first editor I had.
And they suggested it, or it was kind of like a mutually agreed thing that this is a way to kind of front load some of the action?
Yeah, he didn't. I don't think he specifically suggested it, but the idea of maybe front loading some of the action, I think, may have. I don't know whether he specifically suggested that or just came out of a discussion we had.
Right. Then, otherwise, the natural chapters are kind of around, the journey that these two characters take over time. The law plays kind of a factor in their recurrent things in terms of, like how and when the law is applied. I was curious, like with your own background, having worked as a lawyer, was that a part of it you were kind of drawn to or interested in? Was, the slipperiness of the law and its application within their story?
At the outset, it wasn't that particularly, but when I got into it, increasingly I became interested in that aspect of it, I must say. And, I had a long career as a lawyer, but I was a corporate lawyer. I wasn't a litigator. I wasn't in the courts. I mean, I guess my first year of law, I was in the Department of Justice in Ottawa in the litigation section. But I mean, I didn't have a career in the courts, but because I was dealing with the court martial, uh, I got into some of these issues, and they raised questions for me. The odd thing, I had to go out and double check myself. And I did find that quite interesting. And generally speaking, I think that trials are interesting, and I think lots of readers are interested in trials too.
They're great dramatic moments, right? Because you get everyone all in like one
Yeah,
place, and it spells things out in some way.
yeah, exactly.
So having gone through the process, the original book and then now this book, like, is this something you're gravitating towards for future, or is that TBD in terms of like, do you have another historical fiction in you?
I let me put it this way. I don't have an historical fiction idea in my mind at the moment. And, I don't know whether I'll get around to writing another one or not, to be honest. At the moment, I'm sort of more interested in thinking how I can maybe get these, one or both of these, turned into films.
That, or I mean, considering the like depth of detail in Monmouth Manifesto, like like one of those limited run series, like a TV
Yeah,
thing. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. But that's that's a tough thing to do. It's a very tough business. But um, by the way, I don't know if you're aware of this, but one thing I did do about 3 months ago, I had an Audible version published of Monmouth Manifesto. Um, Now, I don't listen to books online myself, but I know a lot of people do. So I decided to have an Audible version done by uh, a guy whose reputation I discovered, named Simon Vance, who's a British American narrator of fiction, including major works like Dickens and so on. And it was interesting for me because he did a narration of this book, which is now available. And listening to his narration of my book was interesting for me because, it gives you a slightly different take in various places, on what I'd said.
And you're not hearing it in the voice that you imagined anymore. You're hearing it in a different
Well,
voice.
it's a little bit more like certain things. When I listen to them from him, are emphasized more than I'd realized when I wrote them, maybe, sort of thing, or maybe I'd forgotten writing them. I don't know.
Well, for visual readers, the Monmouth Manifesto available through Friesen Press, and it sounds like obviously for those who I don't listen generally either. I find I read faster than other people read, but the audio version available as well. James, thank you very much for taking some time to join me on the program and discuss the book.
Well, thanks again for having me.